Now, one of the things obviously the network would be very interested in is the climate change issue, as is the Friends of the Earth, obviously. And there's the climate change bill, which is reportedly moving its way through the system. What's your expectations of what will be in that bill?
It's a good question. My expectations are anxiety at the moment, because we're not sure what's happening as the bill. We've had some information about what the government was intending when they published a framework document, a concept note last December, which wasn't perfect by any means, but did make it clear that the government's intention was to put into law the political promises they've made since they came in 2007, which was basically that Irish emissions would decrease by 3% a year on average. Obviously, it won't be precisely 3% each year. And that would translate into a legally binding target for 2020 of an 18% reduction in Irish emissions below 1990 levels. So given that we're at about 25% above 1990 levels, that's a considerable challenge, but only just about putting us on the right path. We should really be going at 4% a year to put us on the path to where we need to be by 2050. So even 3% would get us going, but would have to accelerate after 2020. If that is done, and if that's done without having too many loopholes to allow us to offset our commitments by buying credits overseas. If that's done, then we're on the right track. And that's what the government have promised. They said 3% reduction in our emissions. They didn't say 3% reduction in China's emissions. So this is about putting Ireland on the right track and investing now in the green economy and laying the infrastructure now, and maybe even gaining some first mover advantages in things like wave and tidal power, as well as playing catch up on wind. We think the law could really be a cornerstone of the green enterprise economy. So that's what we would hope for. We are fearful that other the departments of government for whom this would be a challenge, like agriculture and transport and enterprise trade and employment, are working hard to undermine the bill, or at least to water it down, shall we say. And we don't know to what extent Fianna Fáil will honour the agreement they made with the Greens in the programme for government, and we don't yet know, and this is the key test, to what extent the Greens will use their political capital to stand up for what they've had agreed and insist on the bill being as strong as was promised. So those debates are being had right now, of course, behind closed doors, as these things happen. It's only, by the time it gets to one of the things we've learned in this process is by the time a bill gets to the Dáil, particularly a cross-cutting bill like this, a lot of the big negotiations and a lot of the big decisions have already been made. They're being made at cabinet and between departmental officials. So our expectations are that the Greens will deliver what they got in the negotiations with Fianna Fáil and what they've promised and what's in the programme for government. That is what our expectations, and we hope they will be fulfilled in the next couple of weeks.
Now, do you expect the bill to contain provisions for enforcing those targets or means of enforcing those targets?
Yes.
Because the targets are useless unless
the targets on their own are potentially not, putting the target in this law doesn't in itself make them met, but it is about putting in place the rather policy wonkishly the policy architecture to deliver them, the decision-making processes. So, for example, one of the debates is where you locate overall responsibility. Is it with the Taoiseach's department, or is it with the one minister who has the power to? Because every department needs to act. Who has the power to get them all to act? And there's some debate on that. The Labour Party, for example, thinks it should be the Taoiseach. The Green Party thinks it should be the Minister for the Environment. So there'll be that element of it. Who's accountable to the Dáil? Who has to stand up each year and say how we're doing on our progress? Another mechanism is this idea of a powerful climate change committee, like they have in the UK, of independent experts, not stakeholders, not the social partners, but independent experts in economics and climate science, in agriculture, etc., who would recommend to Ireland what our fair share of effort should be to the government and the kinds of policies we should entertain, and will then, like the British Climate Change Committee has just done today, issue annual reports on progress before the government then has to come back and respond with the next year's plans. And then also we would think there's a role for a very powerful committee in the Oireachtas say like the Public Accounts Committee now, which has an opposition chair on financial matters, that the Climate Change Committee or the Carbon Accounts Committee would be able to summon the Minister for Agriculture or Enterprise or Transport or wherever and say, well, you haven't met your targets for this year. Because the other element of this, as well as the binding targets, is that we're saying the government should adopt 5-year carbon budgets in the same way as they have in the UK. And a budget is, as we know, is simply saying this is how much we can spend, or in this case, this is how much we can pollute. So as well as the 2020 target, we should have a 5-year target, a legally binding target of a carbon budget. But within that, it's important that every year probably the cabinet sits down and says, okay, this is our budget. How much for agriculture? How much for for transport? Because there are different countries will move faster in different areas, but that needs to be done collectively. At the moment, the Minister for Environment stands up and says, here's what we think our emissions will be next year, here's a few extra steps we'll take and they'll come down a little bit. But there's no really collective government buy-in to that, and this law is all about inducing collective government buy-in.
Yes. Now, the carbon tax that was implemented recently in the last budget, where are the revenues for that going?
Well, they are going into the... They are technically going into the general coffers, but there is an agreement, I understand, in government that some of them will be recycled into for example, subsidising the grants for greener homes and so on. It is
insulation and the
yes,
like,
and other supports to moving to a low carbon economy. Obviously. Most environmentalists would prefer if it was a fully ring-fenced fund. Although there are those who say, well, the other alternative is actually just to directly lower other taxes. Or in fact, there is an interesting proposal that's mostly come out of the US called tax and share, and this has certainly been talked about in the pillar. We haven't really adopted it forcefully as something we work as something we advocate collectively, but it's there and has much support, which is that actually, because it's going to need to be much higher. €15 a tonne is nowhere near the rate it needs to be at to induce the kind of changes we need. It needs to be like going up towards €100 a tonne or beyond, which if it was just done like that would be quite really challenging for most of us, really painful for most of us. So you make it €100 a tonne over the course of 3, 4, 5 years, but actually you keep some of it in government coffers, but most of it, say €90 a tonne, you give straight back to every adult citizen, every taxpayer, every not just taxpayers, every adult citizen, as their share of that revenue. And that means that all the prices will go up depending on how carbon intensive whatever it is you're buying is, whether it's a good or a service. But if you use less than the average of carbon, because you've been given this money, you'll actually gain money. So there's a real incentive for you to decrease your emissions. It also really tackles the equity issues, because even though it's true that poorer households spend a higher proportion of their own income on fuel because it's such an essential thing, they spend less than the average on fuel because they spend less than the average on everything, being a poorer household. So if they get an equal share of the revenue from a high carbon tax, they will actually make money. They'll be compensated for the higher prices, and indeed if they then invest some of that extra money in insulation or whatever, they will gain even more. So it tackles the equity issues and the public acceptance issues by doing that. But of course, if there's one thing the Department of Finance hates even more than earmarking, it's giving the money back. So I think that is the way it should go in terms of carbon pricing. But as yet, it hasn't got. It might be more popular than property taxes or water charges if they're put to people. But of course, in the budgetary circumstances we want now, there's a real risk that elements in government and the Department of Finance in particular will just want carbon tax revenues. Not for any environmental purpose, but just to have the money. Which is why we're hearing talk of flat rate property taxes and flat rate water charges, which don't have environmental value. The environmental pillar is very strong, that we're looking for a site value tax, which is basically a location benefit tax. So the better placed your property is, if you're right beside the Lewis, the government and the local authorities get you don't just get all the free rent value of the increasing price of your house. That goes back to the government, who've actually put the infrastructure in place. It's much fairer than just a flat rate property tax, and it's what's in the programme for government. But we're hearing far too much talk of a flat rate property tax.
So we'll have to have you keep your eyes on that issue for us, if you would, please.
Well, it's something that Friends of the Earth is supportive of through the pillar, but actually there's organisations like FASTA and a Smart Taxes network that they've put together that have really pioneered that work in Ireland. And I have a fair bit of credit can be taken by them for it being in the programme for government at all. It's something the pillar advocated, but they did all the groundwork on it in the way that we've been doing the groundwork on the climate bill.
Great. Well, Oisin, thanks very much for talking with us today, and best of luck.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.